Reading more books doesn't make you better. It just gives you better ways to ignore what you already know. That sounds cynical, but stay with me because this is meant to be a calm, reasonable conversation. You've probably been told that reading is a shortcut to clarity, discipline, or depth, which is funny because half the time it just confirms things you weren't planning to change anyway. I've read books that felt profound right up until I closed them and went back to doing the exact same thing. Some books don't inspire you. They quietly remove your excuses, which is much less enjoyable. If you want to reward that kind of discomfort, you can like the video and subscribe to my channel without making eye contact with yourself. The real question is, which book you already suspect belongs here? Number 1. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Have you ever wondered why you can overthink a text message for 10 minutes, but make a life decision in under 3 seconds? That's basically the entire book, explained uncomfortably well. Kahneman breaks your brain into 2 systems, which sounds neat and scientific, until you realize one of them is a tired intern running your life on autopilot. You assume you're rational because you can explain your choices afterward, which is adorable. Most of the time, your brain decides first and hands you a justification like a receipt you didn't ask for. I read this expecting to feel smarter. Instead, I just became more aware of how often I'm confidently wrong. The upside is that once you notice this, you hesitate slightly longer before trusting your instincts, which doesn't fix everything, but does reduce the number of avoidable mistakes you swear were out of character. And that hesitation quietly changes how you move through everything else. Number 2. The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Most of your future isn't decided by big moments. It's decided by whatever you do when you're not paying attention. That's uncomfortable because it means your life direction is shaped by things as boring as what you do after dinner or how you react when you're mildly stressed. Duhigg explains habits as loops, which makes them sound manageable, until you realize you've been repeating the same loops for years, like a background process you forgot to close. I used to think habits were about discipline, which made me feel heroic when I failed. Turns out they're mostly about environment and cues, which is less dramatic and far more insulting. You don't rise to your intentions. You sink to whatever is easiest. And once you see that pattern, you start noticing how carefully your day is designed to keep you exactly where you are, which would be fine if it didn't compound so efficiently. Number 3. Atomic Habits by James Clear. Getting 1% better every day sounds harmless, until you realize 1% worse works the same way. This book isn't motivational, it's operational. Clear isn't asking you to change your life, just to stop making it harder than it needs to be. The idea is small changes, almost too small to respect, which is why people ignore them while waiting for a breakthrough. I loved this concept because it let me feel productive without doing anything impressive, which was kind of the point. You don't need a new personality. You need fewer friction points between you and the thing you already know you should do. Over time, those tiny adjustments stack up, and suddenly you're living a different routine without remembering when it happened. The unsettling part is realizing you've been doing this in reverse for years, very consistently, without calling it a system. And that raises a slightly bigger question about what else you've been repeating on autopilot. Number 4. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. Most of your stress comes from caring about things that have quietly volunteered to ruin your mood. This book pretends to be edgy, then calmly explains something obvious you somehow missed. You have a limited number of things you can care about before your brain turns into a browser with 30 tabs open and music playing from one you can't find. Manson isn't saying to stop caring entirely, which would be impressive but impractical. He's saying to care on purpose. I misunderstood this at first and used it as an excuse to be lazy, which felt freeing until it wasn't. The point isn't indifference, it's selectivity. Once you choose what actually matters, everything else loses its authority over your day. And once that happens, you notice how many opinions you are managing for no reason at all. Number 5. Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. You probably learned everything you know about money from people who are also confused by it. That's not an insult. It's just how culture works. This book reframes money less as income and more as behavior, which immediately annoys people who want a step-by-step plan. Kiyosaki's ideas feel simple, almost suspiciously so. because they challenge the assumption that working harder automatically fixes financial stress. I remember reading this and feeling briefly superior before realizing I still didn't track my spending. The real shift here is understanding assets versus liabilities, which sounds technical until you realize most people are accidentally funding their own stress. It doesn't make you rich overnight. It makes you harder to fool by your own lifestyle. And once that lens clicks, you start questioning decisions that used to feel normal. Number 6, The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Being good with money has very little to do with being smart, which explains a lot. This book is quiet, reasonable, and slightly unsettling because it removes your favorite excuses. Housel argues that money outcomes are driven by behavior, patience, and emotion, not spreadsheets or intelligence, which is frustrating because behavior is harder to brag about. I liked this book because it didn't tell me to optimize anything, just to stop sabotaging myself when things were going fine. Most financial mistakes aren't logical errors. They're emotional ones made under pressure, boredom, or comparison. Once you see that, the goal stops being maximum returns and starts being staying in the game long enough for time to matter. And that idea of endurance quietly points beyond money into something heavier you don't usually plan for. Number 7, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. At some point, all the productivity tricks stop working, and the question gets quieter but heavier. This book doesn't care about your habits, your goals, or your morning routine, which is exactly why it lands so hard. Frankl isn't theorizing from comfort. He's observing meaning from inside extreme suffering, which immediately makes most modern self-help feel a little fragile. The core idea is simple and unsettling. You can't always control what happens to you, but you can control how you interpret it. I didn't read this and feel motivated. I felt recalibrated, like my internal complaints had been gently but firmly put into perspective. Meaning isn't something you chase or optimize. It's something you commit to, often without enthusiasm. And once you really absorb that, all the other books quietly rearrange themselves around a much bigger question you can't unsee. By this point, the uncomfortable part isn't that you haven't read these books. It's that you probably know which one you've been circling without touching. Like a conversation you keep postponing because you already know where it goes. None of these ideas are dramatic. They don't fix anything on impact. They just sit there and quietly change how you notice yourself, which is much harder to undo. And if we're being honest, books don't really change your life. They just interfere with the stories you've been using to explain why nothing has. I say that as someone who has read plenty of them at the wrong time, highlighted the wrong sentences, and felt briefly superior for reasons that did not hold up under inspection. At some point, the question stops being what you know and starts being what you do when no one is watching, including yourself. Not in a heroic way, in a very ordinary, slightly boring way, which is probably why the next thing worth talking about isn't another book at all, but the quiet hobbies people accidentally build their lives around without realizing it. Because knowledge changes how you think, but what you repeatedly do when you're tired, distracted, or avoiding something tends to decide the rest.